Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us here. Thanks for being so numerous in that first panel. My name is Guillaume Chatain. I work for Societe Generale-FORGE as head of sales. Societe Generale-FORGE is a fully owned subsidiary of the bank Societe Generale. We're dedicated to digital assets, and I've been tokenizing securities such as bonds and structured products since 2020. I think that puts me in a good place to be moderating that panel. Before that, I've been in the blockchain space for quite some time, and I've been tokenizing structured products since 2017, basically doing some RWA before RWA was even a name. So I have two co-panelists here with me, amazing founders. I'll let you introduce yourselves. If you can introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about what your company is doing in the RWA space, and then we can start taking it from there.
Thank you, Guillaume. So just a quick intro to myself. So as Guillaume mentioned, we were involved in tokenization in the early days. I was tokenizing even before the concept, forget about RWAs, but even before the concept of token existed. In 2013, I don't know if anyone remembers colored coins. It was a protocol developed on top of Bitcoin, and you could actually tokenize things on Bitcoin transactions. And we did some of the first securities on Bitcoin and cash, and using multi-sig to do delivery versus payment. After that, I developed a company in tokenization, one of the first regulated broker-dealers and custodians in Europe. And we did a lot of tokenization from 2016 to 2021. After I sold that, I started to work in this current company, which is the next generation of tokenization infrastructure to allow essentially the convergence of tokens for security tokens with the DeFi infrastructure that's emerging now in the industry.
Hi guys, my name is Piers Ridyard. I am the CEO of RDX-Works. RDX-Works is a core developer of the Radix protocol. Radix is a layer 1 focusing specifically on decentralized finance. We took a fundamentals approach where we said, okay, if DeFi is actually going to start eating the world of traditional finance, you have to be able to first have an infrastructure on which it's suitable to do that. And we sort of looked around the crypto space and we went, well, nothing is scalable enough, nothing is secure enough, and nothing actually creates an end user experience that everyday people could actually interact with. And so we built our own technology stack from the ground up, our own consensus, our own execution environment, our own programming language, and our own user interfaces to basically build infrastructure that we thought was actually suitable for mainstream finance to be built on top of. So that went live in September of last year. And since then, we've started the process of building out our institutional focused products. The first of which we've already announced, which is a product called Anthic, which allows you to bring the liquidity of any asset in any ecosystem across to the Radix platform and essentially allow the mirroring of liquidity on any secondary market to be mirrored onto the Radix network so that you can make sure that you can empower things like liquidation. So you can make sure that you can on a single platform be able to use all the assets that you want to be able to bring into DeFi onto the Radix network. And we've also now started to look at real world assets because obviously once you can mirror liquidity of any secondary market environment on top of a single layer and you can program assets around that, the next thing you start looking at is going, well, what kind of assets can you bring to bear within a DeFi environment? How can you start to bring some of these more real world assets in? And what kind of real world assets are actually most useful to use within DeFi in the first place? So that's us.
Cool, thank you. Question for Avtar. Your company has been funded by some of the largest TradFi institutions on the planet, thinking of like Brevanova Digital, Laser Digital, which is backed by Nomura. How do you consider RWA in the DeFi space? And how can you define it like simply? And please let us understand like what these big companies like say about this and how do they feel about like you entering into that space?
Yeah, thanks, Guillaume. And it's an interesting one because in the early days, I'm sure everybody heard of the phrase that institutions utilize, like blockchain, not Bitcoin. And there's still some institutions that sort of take that approach where crypto is not the way forward, the blockchain is, you know. And I think those institutions are going to change, and that mentality is shifting for sure, because ultimately crypto on its own cannot exist, and blockchain on its own cannot exist. Crypto is a fundamental component of securing the network. But then once you have the network and it's secured by crypto, ultimately what can you do on that decentralized infrastructure? And this is the concept where majority of these institutions are now starting to understand. And the likes of SocGen, what you're part of, and La Nomura and these large organizations, they get that fundamentally you can't separate the two things. You can't separate cryptocurrencies and blockchain. However, what you can do is bring some of the traditional infrastructure now on chain, and that infrastructure which has the logic and the computational capability to build operational capability on that to be able to issue and distribute these more traditional assets. So this is the way they see it. They say, okay, we've got all these off-chain operations and systems and applications. Can we take our assets and just use this decentralized infrastructure and get rid of everything else we've got and just allow the distribution of our assets through here? They get that. And then the step that I've taken with them, I said, okay, rather than trying to do what everybody else tries to do, where you issue an instrument and you try to get your existing clients to purchase it, why don't we take a slightly different approach? Why don't we go for the crypto natives? Why don't we actually take your assets and supply them to people who actually have the wealth on chain? That's the perspective that they're taking. They're saying, okay, let's go for a whole new market. We've got a whole new technology. We've got a whole new market opportunity. We're in this quadrant. Let's try to target that. Let's try to access that. And just to show you how quickly that interest has taken up is we only launched this infrastructure in March this year. In 4 months, we've gone from 0 to 150 million AUM. And we'll talk a bit about this later, but ultimately it's like working on networks like Radix who provide utility for these kinds of assets is why this uptake is being taken up. Because just holding these assets, yeah, fine, you might save a few basis points here and there, but it's due to all the utility that's provided by collateralized lending on infrastructure like Radix or AMMs, etc. And then utilizing these assets on those infrastructures is where the real utility comes in and where the advantage for firms like Nomura, SocGen, etc. for issuing these assets on chain comes in.
I think what you just mentioned, the very important piece that everybody should remember is collateralized lending. I think it's an amazing use case for what we're doing here. As you all know, the first big use case for crypto was speculation. The second big use case, I see it as the stablecoin, tokenizing money, being able to transfer that money like 24/7, cross-border, very cheaply. But RWA and RWA convergence with DeFi is probably like a third use case that is super important. One question here. We've seen DeFi applications with crypto underlying, BTC, ETH. What is like RWA plus DeFi adding to the game? Is it about liquidity? Is it about risk management? How do you see that, like personally, and how do you see that playing over the longer term?
Ultimately, it's about composability. Like the reason that a public ledger is powerful versus a consortium chain that we saw the banks get involved in sort of 2017 era is that when you have a public ledger, anyone can come along and can build any application that they want to, and then the assets that you create on top of that public ledger can then be moved between any of those applications. So, as you said, the first most powerful use case for crypto was speculation, and then it was stable coins. But the reason that stable coins were powerful in DeFi is because you had a single object that represented value that could be moved between applications. So I could take my USDT and I could swap it on Uniswap, but if I didn't want to use Uniswap anymore, I could go swap it on SushiSwap. If I didn't want to use SushiSwap anymore, I could go and lend it out on Aave. If I didn't want to use Aave anymore, I could go and use Pendle or something like that. So what you get is you get these financial primitives which are competing for value, and that value can move instantaneously between any of these applications. So I often think about these platforms a little bit like the starting of the internet. The power of the internet was that any entrepreneur could come along and they could put up a website, and they were competing for attention on the internet, for traffic on the internet, and that traffic can move at a moment's notice. You could just, on your own home, go to any website in the world instantaneously, and that attention would move there on the basis of merit and then the basis of marketing. What you're seeing in public ledgers, Web3 and DeFi, is this ability for capital to be able to move instantaneously between any opportunity that exists. And within crypto, you've seen that happen time and time again within DeFi. A new asset, a new platform, a new application goes live, and suddenly within a few weeks, it has $1 billion under management. That doesn't happen in traditional finance, but it does happen in DeFi. And the reason it happens in DeFi is because of the ease of moving capital between any of these applications, and this open forum for innovation and the ability for people to come along and build something that normally would take a bulge bracket investment bank to be able to build it. You then apply that to real world assets. You start to bring some of the $400 trillion global financial market assets to DeFi. You create these objects in common that you can move between financial applications, and suddenly you have the recipe for an immense shift in the kind of products that can be offered and how quickly people can innovate in the space, and then as a result, how efficiently capital can be allocated. Like, you now suddenly have a level playing field for a competition where you can radically reduce the intermediation fees that you see, you can radically reduce the cost of holding, and you can make it much easier to allocate capital across a very large number of products and services that previously you would have to onboard painfully and slowly with multiple different financial institutions.
Thanks. Amazing answer. I heard collateralized lending. I'm hearing everything goes faster with blockchain technology. I would just summarize that as like increasing velocity of money. Good use of capital, increasing velocity of money, which are super interesting things. As you all know, if you remember your economics days at school, increasing velocity of money is supposed to increase GDP, increase the wealth of everybody. And that's one of the reasons why I'm personally in that space as well.
I mean, it's not, it doesn't necessarily increase GDP if you're only moving capital assets around. The increased velocity of money within an economy is around spending, right? Consumption. This is allocation of capital. But what you would hope is that the increased velocity, the ability to more efficiently allocate capital should lead to an increase in investment in companies that are creating value within economies. I absolutely agree with that.
After 10 years of like allocating money to zombie companies, hopefully blockchain can change that as well. Maybe we switch gear a little bit, talk a little bit about the technology and regulatory challenges. Avtar, you're the CEO of your company. You're also the chief product architect. Can you tell us a little bit about the technology barriers that you're seeing for RWA development, RWA and DeFi development?
Yeah, actually, the technology side is an area of interest for me because, I mean, my role before I got into crypto was I was a physicist, then I became a quant, and I was in that area for about 10 years of my life before I got into crypto. So I have this unique perspective of understanding the financial market at a technical level, but also developing technology to manage those kinds of assets as well. And then going into crypto, seeing how everybody was trying to reinvent the wheel again and again, including not understanding that certain rules existed for certain reasons. And, you know, we saw that from the very beginning. But I think that the role is shifting. I mean, everyone's now starting to understand the challenges. You know, you can't just issue something like you know, what they call ICOs and, you know, everything's going to be fine. Unfortunately, human nature takes over, greed comes in, and all of these kinds of problems can occur. And, you know, the financial markets saw this kind of thing for hundreds of years. And that's why all the rules and stuff were in place. And then there's complexities around jurisdictions, because it's not just about human nature specifically, but it's about different cultures or locations structuring their regulatory requirements in certain ways, depending on what their economy's needs are, countries' needs are, etc. So there's a variety of differences in terms of how do you prevent fraud, how do you prevent people taking advantage, and how do you ensure that you can follow the rules of a particular jurisdiction, etc. So there's a huge amount of complexity in issuing an asset. So understanding where an asset is coming from, that's the first thing, and what you can do with the asset, where you can distribute it, who can hold it, what they have to do with it if they hold it, can they trade it, can they do all of the legal complexity that's associated with issuing the asset. So that's essentially in the contract that underpins the security. Then on the other side is, depending on the location where that contract is being issued from, you have to follow the rules and regulations of the country. Ultimately, these are the kinds of people that can hold only these kinds of assets, and you can't sell these kinds of assets in our country from anywhere else, etc., etc. So the regulation is a separate part as well. So when you're, as Piers was saying, like if you're creating this infrastructure on chain where you can freely move assets around, you can plug them into this AMM, you can plug them into this collateralized lending vault and utilize all these services seamlessly, essentially at a click of a button. That's the future. But what about ensuring that if I do that and I sell this asset to somebody, but that person is in a jurisdiction that should not be able to hold that asset? So all these kinds of complexities come in. So from our perspective, when we were developing the product, the thing that we wanted to focus on was, can you ensure that in the token, a standard token, you can encode in information around the legal side of the issuance? What is this asset? Where is it being issued? And who can actually hold this asset? And then on the other side, have a passport type thing where understanding who the holders are, what jurisdiction they're coming from, the type of investor, etc., etc. And then we've got this matching engine, as you can call it, that connects the assets to the types of users. Once that foundation is in place, you can then create that asset in a standard form on Radix infrastructure, for example, and allow that to be utilized in collateralized lending. And all we do in the background is ensure that's issued in the right way, is held in the right way, but all the utility then occurs on the infrastructure where it's being distributed. That's essentially what we've developed.
So the infrastructure is here. You have like all these processes in place to get to what you want to achieve. Isn't there like this big word called interoperability? Isn't that a challenge? And let me explain from my point of view, working at Societe Generale-FORGE. We've been exclusively working on public blockchains. So we're tokenizing structured products, bonds. We have a stable coin. We recently announced that we would deploy these assets on Solana. But we're the only bank almost to do that on public blockchains. Other asset issuers would do that on, say, Onyx, private blockchains, Hyperledger, and so on. Lots of different blockchains. How do you manage to put all these together? Because you need to create a real marketplace, right? If you want to be successful.
So I think it starts with the issuer, like what you guys are doing already in terms of going, we are going to deploy these assets natively on each of these chains. When you have any asset that is represented by the need for there to be an identified legal owner, in the event, in funds, in equities, in whatever, you always need to have someone who is the ultimate authority as to what that token represents on Ledger. As soon as you have that, which is stablecoins is the easiest version of that to represent, then you have a issuer who can choose where that token is issued, and they can issue it on any ledger that they want. And then they can also make it interoperable, because all someone needs to do is go, hey, I'm sending you this asset, on Ethereum, I now want it on Solana. I think the much bigger problem, and like I want to say a huge congratulations for you guys getting it past the business prevention units of your bank. By that I'm talking about compliance. The difficulty that we see and the reason that most financial institutions are still going down the Hyperledger route or the R3 Corda route or whatever is because that's where we've got to in being able to convince the compliance departments that it's okay to issue. Or it's okay to issue it here because we have full control over everything. We're able to put our arms around it. And back in the early days of the internet, there was a conviction amongst institutions or amongst companies that intranets were going to be the thing. Intranet was the thing, not internet, because the internet was scary and anyone could access it, and if you put it on your server, anyone can interact with your server, and what happens if Russian hackers come along and all this kind of stuff. But what became true was that by having an open platform for innovation, that ultimately won out against closed systems, which is why intranets no one really talks about anymore, and people only talk about the internet. So the biggest problem that most institutions have to get over is actually a risk-based approach to being able to go, yes, we can issue on a public ledger and that's okay. And from an interoperability point of view, once you've got to that, then your interoperability from the point of view of issuing RWAs that have some legal basis in the real economy, that has to have some owner that's represented, that's not the hard, it doesn't become hard anymore. You're just doing what Tether's doing, you're just doing what USDC is doing, and you're issuing natively and allowing bridging. That's not difficult. The most difficult thing is the compliance problem and getting institutions to build on public ledgers and not private ledgers.
You have something to add, Avtar?
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I think, once you solve that compliance issue, everything else technically is solvable. Like, once we've solved this compliance issue, we want to get these assets onto all the chains and ultimately allow utility to develop on top of that.
I agree with all that, but there are some caveats. I'll share my experience. When I started working in the RWA space in 2017, I applied to the FCA sandbox. I was very amazed to see like the regulator, how aware they were and the questions they were asking. There was a lot of education to be done, but they were very business friendly. When I joined SG-Forge 6 months ago, there were also lots of discussions with compliance, and I'm personally amazed with like how well versed they are into the space. We've been evolving in that space since 2020. They understand how the on-chain analytics are working. They're asking the right questions. And obviously, when you're a 160-year-old bank, like AML, KYC is something that is top of mind. And it's something that you cannot miss. You cannot fail there. But I see it's like a lot about education. And do you see your role as founders in that space as like educating, well, your clients, but also educating the issuers, going to educate the big institutions?
Yeah, I can take the education one as well. I think that's a common question for both of us, really, because from our perspective, education is fundamental. I operated with the FCA sandbox. I work with regulators in other jurisdictions as well. You're absolutely right. The regulators are quite well versed. They're very technologically savvy nowadays. They're not, obviously there's the more traditional side of the regulators, but the innovation teams, they are quite well versed. They understand these things. And sometimes it's not just about getting them over the line about understanding. It's about the friction and the inertia of, okay, what if something goes wrong and we're seen as the first people who blindly accepted it, and something goes wrong and then we're going to be seen as the idiots on the world stage. And I think nobody wants to be seen as they were the first and they failed. But ultimately, this is why everybody plays the wait and see game. Let somebody else go first and see what happens. Having operating in this space since 2013, for the first 5 years, we couldn't get any institution to issue any instrument. But then the issuers became more educated and they said, okay, the risks for us as an issuer are minimal. And they understood that. And they accepted the risks, they controlled for the risks, and we helped them actually do that. Where the real challenge actually happened is educating the buy side, the distribution side. investors, the traditional side of investors, they are very risk averse in terms of they don't want to go and hold these assets through a crypto custodian. They don't understand any of that. They've got their custodians, they operate through CSDs, they understand their infrastructure. All they care is about managing their portfolio, and they want to hold assets in a traditional way. Educating them till the cows come home, you're not going to get them to shift huge amount of assets from their existing portfolio to this new form of investments, even if it is the same identical asset, because ultimately for them, it's an extra overhead, extra headache, and they're going to have to explain it to their clients or their seniors, and it's just going to add extra cost for them. So that shift is going to take some time. So as a result, for us, we're not wasting too much time in that education. We're focused on crypto native organizations, foundations, chains, startups, other organizations that already operate on the networks, and they want to manage their entire treasury and portfolio on chain. They want to access the tools like collateralized lending and automated market making on chains. These are our clients right now.
So you're letting me do the hard work from within.
I think, look, like, why do these institutions care about crypto in the first place? They care about crypto in the first place because of the opportunity, right? Like, crypto is now a multi-trillion-dollar asset class. And 3 years ago, 10 years ago, you would say to a bank, hey, I want you to hold Bitcoin. And they'd say, no way, it's for drug dealers. There's no way in earth we could ever get it past the compliance department. Fast forward to today, and you've got Bitcoin ETFs that are holding billions of dollars of Bitcoin. If you spoke 4 years ago to a hedge fund and said, hey, we want you guys to borrow via a decentralized lend-borrow platform, over-collateralized lend-borrow platform, stablecoin, they go, no way, we could never get that past our compliance department. But now we look at Aave, and you can borrow USDC at 3% or 4% against collateralized BTC or collateralized ETH, and suddenly the hedge fund's going, wow, I want 4% lending, or I want 5% lending. So there's two models here. One is you go to the institutions and you try and convince them that they should adopt crypto, and they're always going to be defensive. They'll be like, well, why? Like, convince me why. Or you can focus, as you guys are, on just carrying on and building the crypto industry and working out ways of sucking in more assets that are able to be used within these incredible applications that we already have on Ledger, and within the capital that we already have here. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. There's enough capital here to fundamentally reshape the kind of assets that you can use on top of public ledger. And now we're seeing people like SocGen, and we're seeing people like BlackRock coming into the industry because they're recognizing the opportunity. And when they come in and say, okay, now we want to access this, tell us how, that's the opportunity for education. But before that point, I think you're just bashing your head against a brick wall.
Yeah, actually, I just want to add to that, because Piers brought this thing about 2 trillion of assets, and that's, you hear this number thrown around everywhere where, in about 5 years, it's going to be 2 trillion or 30 trillion, etc. How are we going to get there? And, ultimately, we're going to get there not because these institutions are going to come in. Ultimately, we're going to get there because the on-chain wealth is going to increase. I believe, ultimately, infrastructure like Radix is probably going to be worth as much as Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan in about 10 years' time than these individual institutions, because ultimately this is how this infrastructure is going to develop. It's going to develop from the inside out. As the wealth comes in, the assets start increasing in value. We start bringing in a lot more RWAs, and that's being held by on-chain investors. The economy starts to develop. I think this infrastructure is going to develop separately, but over time, this infrastructure is going to converge with the traditional infrastructure, and they're going to sort of come in at that time.
There is going to be convergence. And I have to take a step back compared to what you both said, because I'm on the other side of the fence. Like, I'm working for a bank, we're innovating like crazy, and I believe there's going to be convergence, and the convergence is happening in DeFi. I want to talk about like real use cases. If you can share some of them, I'll tell you what Generale-FORGE did in 2023. We tokenized the bond issued by Societe Generale. We put it on MakerDAO. We borrowed DAI against that bond. We then converted that DAI into USD and gave it back to our bank, Societe Generale. Quite amazing. When I read that, it was like, it's crazy that the bank is doing that. We were the first. There's going to be more. I think the convergence, as I said, is happening in DeFi. Do you have I'm sure you have some real use cases, real examples that you can mention?
Yeah, I mean, I can give one example. It was actually publicized just about 2 months ago, where, for example, we were talking to a few chains. Solana was one of the key ones. And they mentioned to us, look, we've got, large amount of cash. It's sitting there on chain. And ultimately what we would like to do is that we would like to not just put it into money markets. Everyone's tokenizing money markets. It's like a freebie nowadays that, you want money markets, here it is. Ultimately, they said we want something a little bit more interesting, but no one's tokenizing these assets on the Solana network. So if you guys can bring these kinds of assets on chain for Solana, that'd be great. So what we had to do is we tried to look at, okay, what would it take to deploy essentially private credit, hedge fund, and other forms of assets, as well as the money market, onto Solana in a way that is seamless. Now, Solana is very different to things like Ethereum and all the other EVM type chains. The reason people always issue assets on EVM chains is because there's a lot of precedence. There's a lot of code out there. You can just create the asset, create the token, and you can issue it, and that's it. We don't just do that. We don't just create an ERC20 and say, okay, here's your token. In our infrastructure, there is some other logic involved around compliance and checks, etc., and we execute all that on the app chain. And ultimately, as soon as all that's executed on the app chain, we can then deploy the tokens with certain checks on the mainnet. So with Solana, we looked at their token extensions, and within 3 weeks, we were able to deploy 4 funds, essentially using token extensions. And we deployed the BlackRock money market, and the Hamilton Lane private credit fund, and 2 other hedge funds as well. And ultimately, within that period, they managed to manage all of their portfolio on-chain for those assets, in those assets. And they're planning to now utilize this service and open it up to other clients and users on the network as well.
Very cool. Piers, any examples you can mention?
Most of the things that we're working on at the moment in this space we haven't announced yet, so I can't actually talk about it. But I think that the most interesting aspect that we're seeing at the moment as a trend is the type of collateral that people are using in lend borrow. So if you look at collateralized lend borrow in the traditional space, if you go to your prime broker and you go, I have these equities or I have these funds and I want to be able to borrow against it, your prime broker will be charging you 8 to 9%. What you're starting to see in the DeFi space is that institutions are starting to understand that when you put your assets into a lend borrow platform, you're actually receiving interest income, you're receiving yield for those assets being available to be lent out, as well as being your collateral for borrowing. So what you actually get is this pass-through effect. Instead of going to a bank where the bank will then lend out on the back end and pass you through basically 0 interest or like a token amount of interest, whilst they're earning 8-9% on lending it out. On a DeFi market, you're able to put in some collateral, and that collateral is instantly earning you a return. and then you can borrow against that collateral to be able to borrow something else that you want to short-term trade. Now, your cost of borrowing is now reduced by the lend-out rate that you're getting. So if I'm paying 9% to borrow stablecoins, but I'm earning 5% on my collateral, my actual cost of borrowing is now 3%. If that collateral is also earning yield, so let's say I put it in a money market instrument or something like that, and the yield on that money market instrument is 5%, I'm now actually getting paid to borrow. My entire cost is negative 2%. Now, as a result of that, what you're going to see is some really interesting leverage products that are going to come out of the lend-borrow space. You're already seeing this happening within DeFi. The simplest example of that is if you look at RWA, the biggest two assets that are lend-borrow are ETH and STETH. Why are they doing that? Because what people are doing is they are taking their ETH, they're staking it, getting liquid staked ETH, which has a yield associated with it. They are putting it on RWA, they are borrowing ETH against that, they're turning that into liquid staked ETH and they're putting it back in, and they're doing these yield loops where they're leveraging up yield. So a yield product that was only yielding something like 3% is now able to yield something like 20-25%. And I think that the more that we're able to create these intermediated or these markets where you can essentially compound the value of the collateral against your lower lending costs, you're going to start to see some really interesting structured products coming out of that.
That's interesting. We'll have to do the math together backstage, but can you raise your hand if you're degen enough to do any of these things that you just mentioned?
We haven't got any degens in the audience. We've got one degen in the audience. 2 degens, 3 degens.
We have we have a long way to go. That's a good segue to come back to the piece about education. As founders, like, how do you feel and how are you helping educate people? Like, look, less than 3% is degen enough to invest in this type of strategies. How do you see your role? What are you doing, and what can I do on my side as well to help?
So I think from our perspective, we're trying to take a very pragmatic approach. We're not trying to educate the masses. We know that these solutions, these technologies, these products are not going to be for everyone today. The people that we're going for are the more who are developing the solutions, the companies, the technology. So how can we provide an embedded solution that somebody is developing for something else? So it could be implicit that when their clients come in, it's being used underneath. So in a way, we don't need to sell it to the public. The public will access it indirectly. That's our approach. So we're working a lot more with the companies and the developers, the quants, the people who are actually designing the end solutions for the clients.
Piers, 20-second response. Okay. Well, we have 20 seconds left, actually, so let me just finish with one quick question. How do you see RWA and DeFi working together and evolving over the next 5 years?
I think that essentially what you're going to see, what we saw in DeFi summer, it was, one of my friends once said to me, what's the point in DeFi? Everyone is just selling 3-legged donkeys. And I said, well, the most important thing about these markets is that they are incredibly efficient markets for 3-legged donkeys. As soon as you start getting real world assets in, as soon as you start getting these assets that actually matter to people, you now have already got the infrastructure for creating incredibly efficient markets for those assets. So I think the next 5 years of RWAs isn't going to see huge innovation in the kind of infrastructure that's available. It's just going to see massive amounts of capital coming in to use those efficient marketplaces. So I am most excited by what's going to happen in terms of the capital type of assets that people can put capital into in the next 5 years.
Avtar?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's the coming together of these solutions and the capital coming in to actually use the existing solutions. I don't think there's going to be a magical innovation that's going to drive the uptake. Absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, I'm very positive about that. If I can give my opinion, I think within 5 years, there's really going to be a convergence between what you guys are building, especially you on the degen space, and what we are doing as banks. The convergence where traditional assets are tokenized and used as collateral for lending, especially in DeFi protocols, is something that is going to happen. I don't know if it's 5 or 10 years, but it's going to happen and it's going to be a massive change. Well, I hope you all enjoyed the discussion. Thanks very much for staying, at least. And thank you.
Thank you.
All right.